Right, hello folks, back with the next instalment of the Invasion Threat series. So we're going to pick up again from where I last left off, and I think last time I finished in about early May 1940. What we're going to do with this video is take a look at mid to late May 1940. So as always with this stuff, with these videos, I'm working off a script just to make sure that I get all the information out that I need to get out. So what we're going to do this time is we'll start with the picture from the Home Forces perspective in mid-May 1940. We'll work to the end of end of May 1940. So with these videos, as I'm doing the research for them, it's becoming very, very clear to me that I can't just like chop up a year into like nice quarters or something like that. I'm having to do these videos to properly reflect the developing invasion threat as it was seen by the British military in 1940 in this case. And this is the reason why I've chosen this period of mid to late May 1940, because some very interesting things happened within this relatively short space of time. And from what I'm seeing in the research and through the documents is that we've got this almost transition period from the East Coast being seen vulnerable and most at risk to threat to invasion, to that slowly transitioning towards the South Coast. And as we've seen in the previous videos, the South Coast, as I like to rub in, was late to the invasion party. But we're now starting to see things move further towards the South Coast. So just as a very quick recap, we've seen so far that the invasion threat raised its head pretty much within a couple of weeks of war being declared in September 1939. We've had a look at that period. We've had a look at early 1940s, seeing how the invasion threat developed over time. And we've just taken a look in the previous video how the invasions of Norway and Denmark influenced the British military's assessment of the threat of invasion in 1940. So it's at this point that we're only just starting to get to the bit that everyone knows about, and that's the South Coast coming under threat of invasion. And this is the point where everyone, as I keep on saying, this is the point where everyone thinks the invasion threat started, which obviously it didn't, as you can see with these videos. Just as as always, my disclaimer with these videos is it doesn't matter, as always, it doesn't matter if you don't think the invasion was viable or the Germans weren't serious or they had no intention of actually coming, whatever. This whole series is looking at the invasion threat, how it was perceived by the British military, primarily the Home Forces, the Chief of Staff Committee and the Joint Intelligence Committee. These have been the military organisations responsible for defending the UK during the Second World War. We're not looking at the opposite perspective, which is that of the invader, which is the way this period is always considered. We are looking at how the invasion threat was seen by the British military, which is something that's rarely done. So again, it doesn't matter if you don't think the invasion threat was viable. I am outlining here the history of the perception of the threat of invasion to the UK during the Second World War. Right. So as always with this, I'm using primary sources to demonstrate how this threat developed and changed over time. As I've mentioned probably in my previous videos, I don't like to quote the work of other people, published works and books and things like that. I like to get to, the kind of ground level. I like to see what was actually going on through original source documents rather than taking for granted what other people have written and not questioning what they've written in their assessments. I would rather take a look at the primary documents and present what those documents tell us about the threat of invasion. And this is one of the reasons why there's no kind of like fixed period in which I'm covering in these videos. That's because the invasion threat, as I'm researching it, is changing constantly, and I need to be able to reflect that properly in these videos rather than just doing a broad overview. I want this to be one of the most detailed accounts of how the threat developed during the Second World War. To aid me in presenting this information, I'm consulting a range of primary sources, but in this case and in this video I'm using the Cabinet War Files, which are provided by the National Archives based in Kew in London. As always, references are provided at the bottom of the relevant slides, so if you want to chase up these references and take a look at them yourself to learn more or corroborate what I'm saying, then you are more than welcome to do that, and you're also able to do that with the references I'm providing. Um, I'm going to point out here as well that I didn't consult one of my primary source of information, which is, excuse me, the unit war diaries, because I thought in this video, I'm not wanting this to be a massively long video, but it'll probably end up being a 2-hour video or something as always. But I think the Cabinet War files actually give us a decent enough insight into the threat of invasion and this development in mid to late May 1940. So I'm just using those in this occasion. Right, let's start by setting the context of the upcoming talk. So by mid to late May 1940, here's a map showing the situation in terms of occupied countries. So green, we have countries that were either allied or unoccupied, primarily allied countries to the UK. In red, we have occupied countries and Nazi Germany itself, and then in blue we have the neutral Republic of Ireland as well, just to highlight the location of that. So by April and May 1940, we know that the Nazis had invaded and occupied Norway and Denmark, opening up the whole of the east coast of the UK and the Shetland Isles to invasion, as it was seen by the British military. Following on from this, the invasion of France and the lowland countries, so that's the lowland countries being Luxembourg, Belgium and the Netherlands, commenced on the 10th of May 1940, and this saw the Germans push into Belgium, Luxembourg and the Netherlands and parts of France as well. So this map shows that here. So we've now got, as I've just said, Norway, Belgium and Luxembourg occupied and capitulated, under German occupation, which again starts to kind of like close the noose around the British Isles, around the UK. But the kind of like the trap hadn't been kind of fully set at this point. It's worth also noting at this point I haven't mapped the areas which were in France which were occupied, had been invaded by the Germans just yet as well, because I can show that later on. It's just by the by really. So it's worth me saying here that if you haven't already watched my previous videos on this subject, then please do. You're going to have to watch those to get the full context of this video. And something that I've covered in those videos was the fact that the Chiefs of Staff Committee and the Joint Intelligence Committee had kind of predicted the occupation of Belgium and seen it as a key requirement for control of the air to aid in the enemy invasion of East Anglia. So please do watch those previous videos if you haven't done, because a lot of this isn't going to make sense otherwise. So one of the reasons I've decided just to look at mid to late May 1940 is because this, as I've already mentioned, represents what I've found now as a transitionary situation between the capitulation of Norway and Denmark and before France had fallen. And this provides us some interesting insights into how the situation developed and how quickly the COSC reacted to the changing situation and its influence on the invasion threat as it was perceived by the British military, comprising the Home Forces, Chief of Staff Committee, and Joint Intelligence Committee. I'll try and abbreviate those as I go through this, go through the presentation. Okay, right. Let's get into the documents. So, excuse me. The number one subcommittee issued an assessment just 3 days after the commencement of the invasion of the lowland countries. And this assessment appeared in the Home Defence Executive number one subcommittee's Appendix A, which was issued on the 13th of May 1940. This document itself contains quite a bit of information which expands on some of the previous threat assessments, which is why you need to watch my previous video. And I thought I'd just start with this because it starts to show this change of invasion threat. So first, one of the first things I spotted in this document that was interesting was one of the kind of reactions that was, or one of the active, I can't think of the word. One of the methods that was put in place to preempt or monitor an invasion fleet in the North Sea, and this was undertaken to give prior warning of a potential invasion fleet in the North Sea, and this was by setting up submarine patrols adjacent to the most likely areas of invasion. Again, key point here is that it was deemed that the areas most likely to be attacked were Yorkshire and the East Anglian coast. So what they did was set up a submarine patrol adjacent that out in the sea to give prior warning of um, of these areas. And this is one of the things I find most interesting. Again, reiterating that from the British military's perspective, the most likely areas that would be hit by an invading force would be the Yorkshire coast and the East Anglian coast. Right. Next, we have a further assessment of the seaborne threat of seaborne attack, and as in the previous videos, this focused mainly around the Shetland Isles, the Yorkshire coast, and the East Anglian coast. But there's been a bit of, I think there's been a bit of a change here. Excuse me. A bit of change here in the area that's most vulnerable to seaborne attack. Excuse me. So on the Yorkshire coast, the area from Sunderland to Flamborough Head was seen as the most likely area that a seaborne attack would take place. And then on the East Anglian coast, we've got the area from Sheringham to Clacton, seen as the most likely place where a seaborne invading force would land. They also outline as well in this like kind of final paragraph here that although these are the key areas that they think are going to be that are most at threat or at risk, there's an even larger area that could potentially be used for the landing of enemy troops from a seaborne force. Right. Next up, we have an assessment of the airborne threat, and this was also assessed to be most likely to take place in an area from Sunderland to the Humber Estuary, and then on the kind of like East Anglia, we've got an area from the Wash to the Thames Estuary, and then the Thames Estuary to Hastings. So we're starting to see this threat move around the coast to the south coast. I feel like a weather presenter there. Anyway, yeah. What's interesting about this is from this, it doesn't seem to actually outline what this threat was, whether this was aerial bombardment or the dropping of airborne troops. It just kind of says, you know, they're likely to attack aerodromes in the area where they want to land troops. It doesn't make it clear whether this is from the air or from the sea. I'm going to assume that this is a combination of aerial bombardment of specific areas, including aerodromes, and landing of paratroops to capture them as a prelude to a seaborne force landing. Anyway. And what have we got next? So this should be, yes, it's a map. So how does this all look? Just to kind of visualize this, obviously we've got, you know, the now occupied parts of Europe. In this black hash, we've got the hashed area, we've got the Shetland Isles, which were one of the key seaborne areas. Then this area from what am I trying to say? Sunderland to Flamborough, and then from Sheringham to Clacton. And then the red area is this area where the airborne attack was more likely to take place from Sunderland to the Humber Estuary, and then the Wash to the Thames to Hastings. So just to allow you to visualise that. Right. Okay, what next? So the next document that's worth highlighting is the Chief of Staff Committee report, which was issued on the 18th of May 1940. So this was kind of like, well, not kind of like, this was one of the first documents that properly reflect the developing situation as it was on the 18th of May 1940. So this report outlines active measures to be put in place to resist an invasion. It outlines several measures which we don't need to cover in this series, but I will look at in the next series looking at defensive strategy, because there's some really interesting stuff in here. But the key points, because we're trying to analyse the threat of invasion as it was perceived by the British military, we're just going to focus on that aspect. So, though this document itself doesn't actually provide much insight into the likely area of invasion or the current threat assessment, it does highlight that the COSC were aware of the need to react quickly to the changing situation on the continent. Key points were how well prepared the Germans were for invading Poland, Norway, Holland and Belgium, as well as the clear belief that invasion would be undertaken of the UK. The COSC clearly saw the threat of invasion as real and outlined their initial recommendations to protect the country, prepare it for and prevent invasion. And again, I'll be covering this in more detail later. If you want to pause and read this, please do. Right. Also, there was an input from the Joint Intelligence Committee as well, as you'd expect in this. Right. So I need to be aware here that my slides start to get a bit messed up because I messed up earlier. So, right, I'm going to have to try and remember stuff now. Right. And another interesting point that comes out in this report is also this is one of the first times that we see the mention of the perceived threat and the possibility of invasion by the Republic of Ireland. So it's outlined in this document. There's the potential that the enemy would land paratroops in the Republic of Ireland, and yeah, this is something that develops over time. So this threat to the Republic of Ireland is something that we'll see as a theme that crops up in my later videos in this series, and something I'll cover in more detail later on. But this is the first time we kind of see this mentioned explicitly. And there's also plans put in place to let the governments of the Republic know what's going on here. Kind of as an aside to this as well, so one of the things I thought is worth pointing to as well is that I found I was able to cross-reference this information with another document in the Cabinet War Files, and this is the War Cabinet conclusions, which were issued on the 20th of May 1940. And this threat of the use of paratroops to capture or invade the Republic of Ireland apparently came from intelligence that an anonymous source that was in contact with the British ambassador of Lisbon. So an anonymous source passed on this information from somewhere that the Germans were planning to drop paratroops on Ireland to invade the country. But this kind of gives you an insight into where some of this information was coming from, but also shows how this information in this case was passed up the chain of command and used to influence the threat level and the assessment of the invasion, and gives you an idea of where some of this information was coming from. So I thought I'd just stick that in there. Right. Moving on to the 21st of May 1940, this is where we see a Joint Intelligence Committee report issued. Sorry, bear with me. And this was also another major reassessment of the threat of invasion. And again, like I've just said, this was on the 21st of May 1940, and this was issued by the Joint Intelligence Committee. So remember, by this point, Belgium, the Netherlands, Norway and Denmark had fallen. As the JIC and COSC had outlined previously, the capture of Belgium was kind of like one of the key objectives that the Germans would need to do to undertake to prepare for invasion of the UK. So now that Belgium had been captured, this ensured that one of the conditions of the invasion of the UK had been met, with the possibility leading to the possibility that air cover could be gained for an invading force on East Anglia. So by capturing Belgium, there was the potential there that the Germans could use that to gain air superiority over East Anglia as a prelude to invasion, meeting one of the objectives outlined by the COSC and the JIC. So this is one of the reasons why they start to worry. So let's take a look at what the JIC outlined in their report. Firstly, by the time this report was issued, it was assumed that the Nazis had captured Belgium and parts of France, as well as Holland, Denmark, and Norway. Because remember that this was still ongoing, and as they were writing this report, the situation was changing, and I think at this point as well, the invasion of Norway and Denmark was still ongoing as well. So they had assumed by this point the report went out that those countries have fallen. Right, next. Yes, so it's the assumption that's already fallen. And it's believed that, so this report focuses on the German invasion of the United Kingdom with particular reference to the Kentish coast. So now that nearby Belgium had capitulated, as they believed it would have done by this point, this assessment is kind of like weighing up the situation in terms of invasion of Kent. So as we'd seen previously, there had been some consideration of the possibility of the invasion of Kent prior to this, just in passing, but in comparison, the assessments had shown that an invading force was more likely to land in East Anglia until this point. So now that nearby Belgium had capitulated, this made the invasion via Kent more likely, and that's an invasion of Kent, as outlined in this paragraph 1, the object. The invasion of Kent would make it possible to attack and capture London, the capital, therefore, to paralysing the country and government, and also opening up the port of London as a base for future operations in the UK. So the report also shows that the invasion would be preceded, or most likely to be preceded, by air attack, with Kent now being vulnerable to converging attacks. That's attacks from multiple directions. I can't quite get it right on the camera. Hey. Yeah, so the idea that attacks could come from multiple directions, which is what it means by converging attacks, with attacks on aerodromes and sensitive communication most likely as a prelude to a seaborne invasion. Air superiority would be required, and if gained, would lead to an invading force of paratroops being dropped to secure important centres and the approaches to London and the west of Kent. Right, excuse me. So, right, yeah, back to the maps again. So this report does highlight, though, that complete air superiority would not be necessary to drop airborne troops, as Messerschmitt 109s and 110s or 110s could be used to escort the airborne force from Belgium and Flanders. It does also note that these escorts may not be able to protect the entire airborne force, but a proportion would be able to land. So again, that's quite interesting that they're assessing that because of the fall of Belgium, in particular, area, fall of Belgium, an invading force coming from Belgium and Flanders, an airborne invasion would likely be escorted by 109s and 110s, which were now well within range of this part of Kent. So again, we're seeing this invasion threat move around the coast towards Kent. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but I am moving it around, and I don't think it's going to show up. But anyway, this is the kind of key area where these two forces would most likely make landfall from the air. Okay, next up. So there was also quite likely that aerial bombardment from northwest Germany, Denmark and Norway against northern England and Scotland would also likely coincide with the invasion attempt from the air to kind of draw fighters away to the north to kind of like clear the way and confuse things in terms of where the this airborne drop was going to take place. So that's quite interesting. You've got them also preempting diversionary raids further up north to draw fighter command to the north and leave kind of Kent more exposed. What next? Right. So it was determined as well in this report that an air invasion force would attempt to capture an area between Chatham and Folkestone across the North Downs. This force it was an assessment, could comprise troops armed with light automatics, so submachine guns, anti-tank guns and 7.5cm infantry guns as well as mortars. It's also likely that this force could be equipped with bicycles and possibly motorbikes to allow them to move quickly and take their objectives in a mobile fashion relatively quickly. Alongside this, it was also supposed that feints comprising further airborne troops could also be dropped to attack the Shetlands, Highlands of Scotland, and most interestingly, the west of England. So I couldn't quite work out where that force would come from. I assumed from, the Netherlands, but I couldn't be 100% sure. But it's very interesting. They were also kind of predicting. That's not the word I'm looking for, but that's the word I'm going to have to use because I can't. My brain's dying. They were predicting, predicting that there'd be an attempt to drop airborne troops on the west of the country as well. Again, this all the idea behind this is to draw. So we've had the plan or the assessment where it was thought that the Germans would try to attack from the air northern England to draw the fighter command up north. We also have paratroops potentially being dropped in Scotland, in the Shetland Isles as well, on the west coast to draw the land forces up north as well to kind of clear the way for the main invasion force, which would hit Kent. Right. What else do I need to see? Yeah. In terms of the invasion by sea, the report outlines in some detail how the Germans had gained experience of naval ops through the invasion of Norway as well. So it does use that as a thing to kind of like show how well prepared the Germans were and the experience they had. Right. Finally, in terms of the seaborne invasion then, the assessment was that the Germans would try to use the element of surprise before a large-scale landing, using air action and mine lane to deny the approaches to the area that was going to be hit. So deny this area to the light craft of the Royal Navy and use this opportunity to seize a port, possibly Newhaven, Folkestone, Dover or Sheerness, as well as using Kent's many beaches to land an initial invading force of infantry. The report also mentions that the Germans would need adequate port facilities on the continent to support this invasion, such as those in Holland, Belgium or northeast France, because remember at this point the northern France hadn't been captured. But it's worth noting here that this was in a period, before these ports had fallen into the hands of the Germans. And this would leave only the possibility, sorry, I'm just getting a bit muddled up. Yeah, so the report also mentions the Germans would need adequate port facilities, I've already mentioned, and what's quite interesting here is that there is foresight demonstrated by recommending that these facilities, so the ports in Holland, Belgium, and northeast France, would need to be destroyed where possible to deny them to the enemy to use them as part of an invasion scheme or plan. So note that this was, as I've already said, I'm just going to repeat it. No, this was in the period before many of these ports had actually fallen into the hands of the Germans. So by denying these ports on the continent to the Germans, the plan here was to leave them with only the possibility of using ports in northwest Germany to launch this invasion of the UK. Right. I think I've just about muddled through that. That'll do us. Right. So the conclusion of this report is that an invasion via Kent would be well coordinated with elements of the fifth column doing their bit to confuse operations of the defenders in the UK, as well as potential attacks on the command and control network, using false reports and contradictory orders to try and confuse things and confuse the movement of troops. Right, and it's worth me putting this here as well. This is the a little annex, as they call it here, which is a summary of the state of the ports on the continent, noting that some have been already denied to the enemy while others haven't. So I'll just put that there. If you want to read that again, pause if you so wish. Right. 22nd of May 1941, so just one day after this report by the JISC, the next day another report was issued by the COSC. And this report outlined that by this time now Holland had capitulated and been occupied by the Germans. And what's really cool is that this gives us a good idea of how rapidly the situation changed and how quickly it was assessed by the COSC. We saw in the previous report that the JIS, Joint Intelligence Staff Committee, was it? JIC? Can't remember now. I'm not doing very well with acronyms today. But we'd seen that the JIC had preempted the fall of various countries I'd outlined, and now a day later, as they had predicted, one of those countries had fallen and been occupied. Right. So this update by the COSC laid bare that the whole of the south coast could become vulnerable to attack, dependent on how far the enemy managed to advance. Things were still up in the air at this point. The Germans had only just started to push more into France, and much of the north coast of France had not yet been captured. But this would be required to open up more of the south coast to invasion. So there's a couple of interesting bits in this report which I'll highlight here. Firstly, the assessment of the maximum effective range of German fighters and dive bombers being 200 miles. So from a home forces and COSC perspective, northern France falling would actually open up a considerable chunk of southern England and open up a significant chunk of the country to airborne attack from, and also bring them under fighter cover and open the area up to dive bombing attack. But this was only if the northern coast of France became occupied. At this point, they didn't know what was going to happen, and this hadn't happened just yet. So it was also agreed that that Germany would struggle to gather the necessary shipping in French ports to support an invasion, but may be able to gather barges and landing craft to support this invasion. Funnily enough, this is exactly what happened later on in the year, and I'll cover this. But again, it just shows how well informed and how well informed these military personnel were. They knew exactly what they were doing. They were preempting the situation that could happen, and in a lot of cases, they got it bloody right as well. So anyway, but the preparations to do this, they also state, so the preparations for invasion in French ports would not go unnoticed by the British military as well. And as we know, they did they knew full well what was going on. Right. So as always, and I bloody love to do this, I'm going to point out that the South Coast was late to the invasion party. So despite the new threat from the air to the south coast, though it was also still summarised in this report that on the 22nd of May 1940, the COSC still thought and still regarded the east coast as more likely to be the area of invasion. So, the south coast can suck it in that respect. Yeah, the south coast was still not seen as the main area of invasion, even in late May 1940. So just to rub that in, I like to rub that in. Right, so what next? This report also outlines that Germany would need to consolidate its position in northern France and Belgium, as well as neutralise part of the Royal Navy to make an invasion of the south coast viable. They would also still need to gain a large degree of air superiority before a large-scale invasion could be mounted. So just to move on, but the military in the UK could not be complacent, as they outline here, and ignore the threat of airborne raids and, to a lesser extent, seaborne raids if Germany gained control of the coast bordering the Channel. So, again, the COSC are saying here we cannot be complacent. We need to be aware that this is potentially going to happen, and the south coast is going to become, vulnerable to invasion. But it will take a lot of preparation for a full-blown invasion to take place, and almost right on cue when the cats has decided to go to the toilet and distracts me. They seem to know when I'm doing these videos. Anyway, so yeah, they're not going to be complacent here, and yeah, not going to take it for granted that Germany hasn't occupied northern France just yet. Right. So I was hoping to keep this one a short one. For me, this is quite a short video, coming at 30 minutes now. So I'm going to draw things to an end there. So I think I've covered. I think I've done the right thing here and shown the situation transitioning from East Coast to South Coast becoming vulnerable alongside the East Coast as well. And I found this particularly interesting myself to research. So just to kind of bring this to an end, I'm going to do a bit of a little conclusion section because I like to kind of draw together my thoughts on this. So just as a bit of a conclusion, as I've shown you, these documents show how the threat of invasion continued to be assessed in pretty much real time, or as close to real time as possible at the time. And this was in line with how the threat on the continent developed. We saw that a few days after the invasion of lowland countries, France commenced, the view was still that Shetland, Yorkshire and East Anglia were the most likely areas of invasion. But this perspective started to change ever so slightly to incorporate the South Coast. I'm not going to say that solely the South Coast became under threat of invasion, because it didn't. Anyway, we'll see that later. I'm going off on a tangent. As the invasion of the lowland countries and France developed, the assessment was updated and the threat reassessed. But even as the battle was ongoing, the military saw the most likely area of invasion at the time was still to be the east coast of the country, or the east coast of the UK. This was because the Germans would need a lot of time to consolidate their gains through the recent invasion and prepare for an invasion from recently captured ports if they wanted to hit the south coast. Obviously, we know that the situation would change later, but as of late May 1940, the situation dictated that the most likely place an invading force would land was somewhere on the east coast, primarily in Yorkshire, the Shetland Isles, or somewhere in East Anglia. Right, next time we'll move on to June 1940. It's going to be a bloody big one. And as you know, things develop even further in that period. But I'll get on with the research for that and be back in a couple of months with that at the rate I'm doing these. As always, I hope you've liked that. If you have, please do like and subscribe. I feel dirty saying that for some reason. I don't know why. Like and subscribe. But if you've liked the videos, like and subscribe. Yeah, it does mean a lot when people do that. It just shows, and it shows that I'm making some progress with the channel. If you've got any questions or comments, please do comment. But don't bother commenting if it's stuff like, they weren't going to invade, because that's not the aim of these. Yeah, you can also actually, it's worth me pointing out here as well that you can also help me by joining my Patreon as a subscriber, where you'll get much more video content and insights into my research into the defence of East Yorkshire. You can help me by donating to my GoFundMe, which is helping me gain the documents that I require to undertake this research. And if you want to drop me a tip, you can do via PayPal or Ko-fi. I'll put the details in the comments. In the whatever it's called, the caption below. I can't think of the words. My brain has completely died. I'm on leave this week as well, and what I've decided to do is actually do more work. But anyway, that's an aside. As always, thank you so much for watching. I hope this has been useful. If you've got any comments on this video, please do let me know, and I'll catch you in the next time I decide to do a video or get around to doing one. Thanks as always, folks. See you later.